This is Unit 3.2, Life History Strategies, also covers K-selected and R-selected species. So we're going to cover those two topics in the context of what we'll call life history. So each organism goes through a series of events from birth through reproduction to death, and how each organism, how each species lives its life determines how it functions within an ecosystem. So life history strategies are often shaped by evolution, what environmental factors shape changes in species. And so they are often operating through natural selection rather than artificial selection, which is created by humans. And these strategies adapt to the specific environment that the species lives in. So life history strategies tend to influence growth rates of populations. And this is influenced through age of first reproduction. So species that reproduce at younger ages, their populations tend to grow faster, whereas species who reproduce at higher ages tend to grow slower. The number of offspring they have, right? If you have more offspring, then your population is usually going to grow faster. Fewer offspring, your population will grow slower. And the amount of parental care given to offspring, right? A dandelion tries to reproduce, there's no parental care. But if a human reproduces, then there's lots of parental care. And finally, the energy cost of reproduction. The less energy it takes to reproduce, then faster a population is going to grow. Whereas a species that requires a lot of energy to reproduce, its population will not grow as fast. So these two patterns that we talked about, or that I talked about a few minutes ago, one is R-selected species. And R-selected species, energy is put into reproduction more than it is put into survival. So these species will spend a lot of energy just reproducing, but then whether those offspring survive is, doesn't garner a lot of energy. R-selected species are poor competitors, right? They tend to just reproduce a lot, but then not compete well for resources. However, R-selected species can be opportunists. So when there are favorable conditions or changes in the environment, they're more likely to be able to reproduce a lot. And because of mutations within their genes, are more likely to produce offspring that will survive in changed environmental conditions, as opposed to species that reproduce more slowly. However, when these favorable conditions are gone, their populations may crash, so they may grow very quickly, but then if environmental conditions change and there's no adaptation, then the population will crash very quickly. These populations can go through unstable or irregular cycles because if they depend heavily on environmental conditions, then if those environmental conditions are irregular or unstable, so will also be the populations of R-selected species. So R-selected species tend to be small-bodied, right? I talked about dandelions. Things like ants also fall into this category. Rabbits are an R-selected species, mice, rats, those sorts of animals. They tend to reproduce when they're young. They tend to make many offspring, and those offspring have a very low survival rate. There's little or no parental care for any of these species. Remember, I gave you the example of the dandelion. It reproduces but provides no parental care. Some species, like fish, may provide a little parental care in the sense that they lay some eggs and may protect the space where those eggs exist. But then really once the eggs have hatched, those fish are on their own. We can see exponential growth in R-selected species. So if there were a graph of their growth, you would see it increasing with a upward curve. And unpredictable environments, they can survive in unpredictable environments because of mutations within their gene pool. By producing many, many offspring, it's more likely to produce some offspring that would adapt to an unpredictable environment. Finally, they tend to be controlled by density-independent factors. So we will talk about density-independent factors, but these are factors that don't depend on the size of a population or how it is distributed. So an example of a density-independent factor would be a natural disaster like a volcanic eruption or a hurricane that affects all members of a population equally, regardless of how densely they are concentrated. Finally, they exhibit a type 3 survivorship curve, and we will look at the survivorship curves at the end of this screencast. Good examples, like I said, small-bodied things like bacteria, right, reproduce very quickly, offer no parental care. Algae, annual plants, like I said, dandelions. Most insects fall into this category. They tend to reproduce quickly, offer little or no parental care. Cockroaches, rodents, right? Mice, rats, rabbits, that kind of thing. Oysters, of course, offer no parental care. The other type of species is a K-selected species. So these species differ from R-selected because their energy is put into long-term survival rather than reproduction. They give high amounts of parental care. For example, emperor penguins, right? Sit on eggs until they hatch, and then even once the animals have hatched, the parents take care of the little penguins. They are good competitors where they tend to get resources over less competitive species such as R-selected species. And they tend to thrive best in ecosystems that are constant environmental conditions. So these animals tend to not adapt well. And so if environmental conditions are changing, then K-selected species tend to die off. K-selected populations also remain close to carrying capacity. So that's a term that you'll have to hang on to until we get to more topics in Unit 3. But every ecosystem has what's called a carrying capacity, which is the number of individuals in the population that can survive based on the resources that are available in an ecosystem. So populations remain, K-selected populations remain close to the carrying capacity over periods of time, and hence they are called K-selected because carrying capacity is labeled as K. Like I said, some characteristics of K-selected species, they tend to be larger bodied, right? Think large mammals like cats, gorillas, humans. They reproduce later in their life. They have fewer offspring, but a high percentage of these offspring survive. They give their offspring high amounts of parental care. As I said, they live in constant and predictable environments. They are controlled by density dependent factors. So density dependent factors include things like the location of food and water. K-selected species also exhibit a type 1 survivorship curve, which we will see shortly. So examples of K-selected species, as I said, humans, very large trees, although they don't provide any parental care, but they produce not very much. Polar bears, elephants, and most mammals and birds really fall into this category. So the slide here shows what's called 3 different survivorship curves. So on the left side is the number of survivors, and this is listed on a log scale. So notice how it goes from 0 to 10, but then 10 to 100, and 100 to 1,000. And on the horizontal scale is the percentage of an individual's lifespan. So it starts at 0, right, 0% up to 100% of the lifespan where everything has died at that point. And notice how for a type 1 survivorship curve, these tend to be K-selected species, such as humans. For a long percentage of the lifespan, there are a large number of survivors, right? Because humans provide lots of parental care for their offspring, and a lot of their offspring survive. And then once humans get much, much older, that's when they tend to die off the most. This is contrasted greatly with type 3 survivorship curve, which is R-selected species, where the number of survivors drops off very quickly because they produce a lot of offspring, but very few of them survive. But the ones who do survive tend to live for a very long time. So this is very typical of plants, right? Think trees. It's very common for trees. Somewhere in between are type 2 survivorship curves, and these aren't really good examples of K or R selected species, but these organisms tend to die off at about an equivalent rate to how they're reproducing. Um, so you won't see too much about type 2 curves simply because it's harder to contrast them with type 1 or type 3. Most often you'll have to match up K-selected species with type 1 curves and R-selected species with type 3 curves. All right, that is it for Unit 3.2. Please let me know if you have any questions.